Hello everyone, this is Peter Svidler for Chess24 with my roundup of round 3 of Altibox Norway Chess 2017. The first two rounds featured exactly one decisive game per round, which is not very surprising considering how strong the field is and how hard these players fight for every chance. Breaking down defenses in this tournament will not prove a very easy task, and we've already seen a lot of evidence of that in the first two rounds. And the third round did not prove an exception. There were a few candidates for the game of the day, but in the end I went with the game between Hikaru Nakamura with the black pieces against the world champion Magnus Carlsen. So let's have a look at what happened in that game. Magnus went 1e4 as he normally does these days, and Hikaru played c5, perhaps already an early indication of what he wanted out of the game, because his other and perhaps the more usual weapon against 1e4 is the Berlin, which he decided not to play against Magnus, hoping to get a sharper and a more unbalanced position. Knight of 3 d6. Magnus used to give a lot of checks against the knight, but these days he goes for the main lines, and today he opted for 6h3, which is arguably the main line against the knight of these days, together with perhaps bishop g5. Hikaru's reply was quite interesting. G6 here is not supposed to be the main move by any means, but against Magnus in particular, this is perhaps an interesting choice, because normally people automatically play something like g4, bishop g7, bishop g2, knight c6, bishop e3, and try to castle queenside with white. And this is perfectly playable. It has been played by very strong players in very important tournaments. But Magnus generally opts for different types of positions with white. And true to himself, after g6, without too much thought, he played g3 instead of g4, which transposes to, this basically leads to g3 dragons with the inclusion of h3 and a6 for black and white respectively. And both of those moves are reasonably useful, so this is not absurd at all, and has in fact been played by very strong players previously. Knight c6, bishop e3. For instance, already here you can see why having the pawn on h3 could be a benefit for white, because there will never be any knight g4 calculations required. Bishop g7, bishop g2, castles. And Alexander Grishuk played bishop d7 in this position more than once, with the idea of meeting knight g5 with rook c8. And he's done reasonably well out of these types of positions, but Hikaru, after some thought, decides to go for knight d7, which is an interesting option, mainly I think aiming to go for mass exchanges on the d4 square and then develop the bishop on c8 towards the b7 square. And generally just aiming for a slightly quieter position, and perhaps making the knight d5 plans a lot less threatening, because for instance you can play e6 and the knight just has to go back, because the usual option of takes and bishop b6 is of course no longer possible. Magnus played b3, a somewhat strange looking move at first glance, but when you think that one of black's ideas could be potentially to play knight d5 with the idea of knight c4, playing b3 makes a lot more sense, because by putting the pawn there, you stop knight c4 forever, and you can just chase this knight away immediately by playing f4. After b3, a very interesting Sicilian player in general, Dmitry Kokarev, played rook e8 here, which is an interesting idea. And in particular, if white makes what in these types of structures is a very usual and very normal looking move, a2, a4, black could perhaps try doing exactly what he's done in the game. And you could actually make an argument here that having the pawn on a4 compared to the pawn on a2 could be in some ways disadvantageous for white, because if he does exactly what Magnus has done in the game, black can just play a6, a5 here, or maybe even e5 followed by, for instance, bishop takes d5 and then a5. And once the knight gets to c5, white will not have the plan of a3 and b4 which Magnus employed in the game. So this would have been an interesting try, but white of course is not obliged to play a4, and Alexei Gogunov, who faced this position against Kokarev, played queen d2 here, which led to balanced positions, but I think maybe with a slight advantage to white. Hikaru, on the other hand, decided not to wait with knight take d4. All these pieces came off, and here he played b6. Obviously, e5, d5 is not something white can play, or at least it's not really all that great. You could still make an argument that white gets some compensation after queen d2, rook a7, and something like rook a d1, but there's really no reason for white to go for any of this. Magnus played knight d5, the most natural move in the position, bishop b7, c4, and here Hikaru went for a structure change, which I was not exactly advocating, but I thought it was worth mentioning this idea live on stream, because it's important to know that the knight on d5 is of course very unpleasant and you don't really want to tolerate it for very long. But taking it immediately when the pawn is still on e7 is really, really horrible. White has a very effective plan of doubling on the a file, and then he starts pushing the h-pawn up the board, and with the black position sort of cut in half by this pawn on d5, it will be very, very difficult for black to defend against an attack on the king side once it gains space. And because of that, black plays e5 first. Because with the pawn on e5, any capture on d5 will become a lot more attractive, since those kingside attacks will no longer really be an option for white, and also there will be no weak pawn on e7, obviously. Magnus played queen e3. There could be an argument for playing queen d2 here, but after bishop takes d5, white probably will have to take with the queen. Compared to the game, after cd5, black has a very important resource. He can play a5, and after a3 and knight c5, it is very, very important that white does not have the immediate b3 before, because knight b3 just wins the game on the spot. And if white has to waste a tempo on something like queen e3, for instance, a4 before knight b3 becomes very interesting, planting the knight on d4 and then continuing from there. And after queen takes d5, knight f6, queen d2, white's position obviously looks very nice, but the bishop on g2 is so far from any action that I think black generally holds these types of structures very comfortably. Just rook queen c7, rook goes to d8, king goes to g7, and the one weakness on d6 is on a dark square, and white will just lack pieces to exploit it properly. Magnus played queen e3 instead, connecting it with different ideas. If bishop d5 immediately, he will probably take with the c-pawn, a5, and now you can play, for instance, a3, and the pawn will get to b4, although of course black can already start something on the king side, and this was probably quite playable for black if he wanted that. That was definitely an option worth considering for Hikaru in that spot. Instead of that, he played b5, trying to improve his situation on the queen side first. And it does force white, I think, more or less, to go for a structure change, which would generally favor black. But in the process, white assumes very serious control over the c-file. So the position becomes very unbalanced and very sharp. Rook a1, I think, is the best move in the position. Now black takes. You really don't want to take with the pawn here, because almost any option in this position will become very comfortable for black. You can just take straight away and place the knight on c5. And once there are no pawns on the b-file, this knight is just completely unchallengeable. And white probably needs to start something immediate on the king side, or he will run the risk of becoming quite seriously worse when black starts assuming control on the queen side, because his dark squares, he controls the dark squares so well with the knight on c5. And the bishop on g2 is a constant problem here for white. Because of that, Magnus took on c4 with the rook, bishop d5, ed, and here I believe Hikaru may have been slightly imprecise in his next maybe 3 moves, gifting white potentially a couple of tempi, because he tried to establish this knight on c5, but it didn't work at all, and it meant that white managed to create a passed pawn on the b-file, whereas black did not really achieve anything on the king side. If you want to play f5, as Hikaru did a couple of moves later, you can start with it straight away. There's really no need to wait. And after rook c6, You can play knight b8, rook b6, and now, for instance, something like rook f7. Just holding things together, and the rook on b6 is quite awkwardly placed. Or you can just play queen f6 with the intention of playing e4, knight e5, and just creating direct counterplay in the center and on the king side. White will get something going on the queen side, but for instance, after rook c7, rook f7, rook fc1, and e4, it is highly likely that the first wave will be parried, and one of white's rooks will have to be traded for either the a8 rook or the f7 rook once black plays knight e5. And then you probably have to be prepared to part ways with your pawn on a6. It probably will get collected in some of the lines. But once the knight lands on e5, you do get a lot of counterplay in the center and on the king side. So that is actually very, very playable. Instead, Hikaru played a5, which is still not a mistake. Rook fc1, knight c5. In this position as well, both rook b8 and f5 were quite playable. I don't exactly know how to evaluate these positions. They probably favor white slightly, but both of those moves were very, very playable. As is knight c5. But after a3, I think Hikaru's choice is questionable. In particular because here he had a very curious option. He could have played a4, to which white most likely replies by b4, and then black via the b3 square plants the knight on d4. And this is a very difficult position to assess, because this is a tremendously good knight. I should paint it some different color. But on the other hand, this structure for white, coupled with a light squared bishop, this is exactly the kind of a protected pass pawn you want to have on the queen side. On the squares north of your bishop, so the bishop will be operating quite nicely between them. It's not limited by those pawns, and white still has complete control over the c file. But the knight on d4 is so strong, and the rather simple plan of f5, f4 is so potentially effective that this position, I think, is completely unclear. It would be very interesting to see what happens from here. Instead, Hikaru played f5, b4, takes, and knight d7, and this is what I was mentioning earlier. Black really could have had sort of the same position, but with the pawns on a2 and b3 instead of already a passed pawn on b4, which has to be in white's favor, because now black constantly has to keep in mind just how fast his counterplay on the king side has to be, otherwise he will get rolled over on the queen side. Rook c6 has been played, and in this position I think Hikaru correctly assessed that he has to put the pedal to the metal, so to speak. There is really no more time to waste. You can play slowly with something like queen f6, b5, e4, but it feels like, especially once the pawn reaches b6, even if black, let's say, manages to play knight e5, the rook is not really hanging anymore, because you can never really take, allowing white those two tremendously strong pass pawns on the queen side. And the pawn most probably reaches b7, and once it reaches b7, black's problems assume very, very serious proportions. In view of all that, Hikaru played f4, which I think is a very good practical chance. G takes f4 followed, because you don't really want to allow f takes g3. And here Hikaru played a move which I thought most people missed. I definitely can say that I missed it when I was evaluating f4. I felt that black needs to play something like maybe queen f6 here, trying to force white to take on e5 and take with the knight, and this is a rather beautiful knight. But of course after queen f6 white can just play b5 and he is much, much better, maybe even close to winning. Or maybe something like rook takes f4, rook takes d6, and rook a2. But none of these things looked particularly convincing. And the move e takes f4, which Hikaru played, at first glance looks completely impossible, because white gives this check on a6 and then picks up the very important pawn on d6 next move. But when you stop and think, you realize that, for instance, rook takes d6, f3 is just completely impossible, because the queen will come to g5 and the rook on c1 will be hanging. And in general, yes, the pawn on d6 will fall, but black gets a lot of counterplay on the king side. Objectively, this may be better for white, but proving that is no easy task at all. After some thought, which was definitely required for Magnus to sort of readjust to the changed landscape, he did play queen takes d6, which is the best move, ensuring that the rook on c1 is protected, and now you can allow f3 and queen g5 check, because it's only a check for the time being. Hikaru played queen g5 immediately, and here apparently the Norwegian supercomputer is, suggested that king h2 is stronger than the king h1 move that Magnus made. But I think playing king h2 here is almost completely impossible from a human perspective, unless you absolutely know that this is the best move. Because it just feels so uncomfortable to run into potential rook a2 and pins along the second. And also on h1, it's unclear how this king will be checked in the immediate future, let's say after f3, bishop f1. Whereas after king h2, f3, bishop f1, it feels like if black somehow manages to shift the queen from d6, there will be immediate checks. Obviously, if computer says this is stronger, it is stronger. There can be no argument against that. But from a human perspective, just putting the king on h2 is extremely difficult, I feel. It's not a natural decision for any human player to make. Machine also suggests initially that rook c8 check, takes, king g7 and h4 is very strong. But here I have a feeling that black probably makes a draw after both queen g4, king h2, f3, bishop f1, and queen g4, white goes queen e6, that was a misclick, queen d1 check, bishop f1. And the moves that black has to make look somewhat weird, but I have a suspicion black probably holds after queen h5 here. Although it does look very, very promising for white, at least initially. And there's also an option of just taking on h4, rook c7, f3, rook d7, fg, takes. And here, white, to avoid the perpetual, white needs to play queen e6 and take on g2. And I'm not entirely sure this is a draw, but my experience with the queen endgames tells me this is likely a draw than a white win, although I could be wrong about that. The machine does suggest that white is better, but of course white is better. The question is whether this is winning or not. And my feeling would be that these days most of these queen endings are likelier to be a draw than a white win. Could be wrong though. Anyway, Magnus played king h1, f3, knight e5, which we were trying to analyze during the live stream, is actually rather poor because in this position white manages to trade off all four rooks, and once all four rooks are gone, we get an endgame with a bishop against knight, and white has not one but two passed pawns on the other flank. So yeah, this is probably close to lost for black. f3 was played instead, bishop f1 and knight f6. In fact, I think Hikaru did not really make any mistakes from the moment he spotted f4. I think his play was very, very good. Machine may slightly disagree with some of his decisions, but I think in most cases he found the more resilient options. So full credit goes to him. In this position, once again, the machine suggests that white is a bit better after queen g3, queen takes g3 and fg. But it's really not that easy to go for this position with white, because optically it looks like after something like rook a2, black gets tremendous initiative with the threat of potentially knight e4, knight g3, and quote-unquote mate. When you start looking at this position with a computer just says you can play something like g3, g4 here, or b4, b5. And those things we thought were mate are not. And perhaps black makes a draw with very precise play, but precise play will be required here. And another option which was in particular very funny to me, the machine suggests that one of the better moves in this position is queen d6 h2. I will just leave this here, as they say on the internets. This is not a move you can make. No matter what the machine says, this is not a move you can make. You have a very, very nice centralized queen which controls a lot of the squares, and you just put it on h2 whilst it wasn't even being chased. No. That would be the extent of my commentary to this move. No. Queen e6 was played, and this is probably not the best move in the position. In fact, it does seem to allow what is very likely a draw. But this move actually occurred to us at all during the live stream, because you do want to control the knight f6 e4 threat, which was very present after knight f6. And you're also creating a threat of rook c7, so it does feel very natural to make this move. And the tactical justification for it is that after rook e8, white has rook c8. And here Hikaru did have the option of playing king g7 here. Rook e8, queen takes c1. It feels for a moment like black might even be winning, but in fact after queen e1 it's still white who is pressing. But you get the feeling that the position after takes, rook b7, b5, knight takes d5 should probably be a draw somehow. Although the machine continues insisting that this is not immediate equality, so perhaps even this is incorrect, and perhaps even here white can ask a lot of questions from black. Instead of this, Hikaru played king g7, and here there are a lot of comments in chat on the subject of Magnus winning a clear-cut, missing a clear-cut victory here, which I think are just completely incorrect, because I have a feeling I even understand what the machines miss at lower depth here. Magnus played rook c7, after which I think his advantage is completely gone, and people were suggesting that d6 is very strong and leads to a white victory. Black plays rook e8, and here I think, once again, my analysis is somewhat perfunctory here, and I could be wrong, but the move I think the machine likes initially is queen c4. And here I believe black just makes an immediate draw by playing rook e4, queen c5, and playing knight d5 here. This is a move which is extremely easy to miss, and in fact even the machine I think misses it at first. But it's incredibly strong because black creates a threat that white just simply cannot parry. Black wants to play rook e4, g4, and once white takes, black will have a perpetual. And black actually plays this pretty much against any move here. Even let's say white goes rook c7, you still play rook g4. Rook f7, king f7, you can make a couple of checks, but in the end you still will have to pick this rook up and agree to a perpetual. And instead of queen c4, the machine suggests you can play queen b3. Black pretty much has, according to, once again, my somewhat perfunctory analysis, black has to find rook e2. And here, the more obvious move, queen takes f3. It is black actually who can test white here by playing knight e4, queen e2, knight f2, queen h2, king h2, queen f4 check. Now, if white goes king g1, this actually appears to lose, because in this position black no longer needs to give a perpetual, and after knight g4, black is much, much better. So white has to go king g2, and black has the immediate perpetual with queen g5, or he can play rook f5 and scare white quite a bit, because this still is a draw, but white needs to make some really scary looking moves to make it. For instance, something like h4, knight g4, and king h1 is apparently a draw, which I would welcome anyone to play, in particular if there's time trouble around. Or you can play queen e7 check, king h6, and rook 6 c3, and after knight e4, apparently the only move which absolutely secures a draw here is bishop e2. Once again, everyone who feels that opportunities were missed in this game are welcome to make all of these moves in a practical game. And the line actually even continues after queen f2 check, king h1, knight g3 check, rook takes g3, and queen takes g3. And this really is no joke. The best move in this position by far is h3, h4. I can just shrug my shoulders. I mean, that's the only reaction I think you can have to these types of lines. Machines do not make mistakes in these lines. Human players, on the other hand, would, I think, struggle to convincingly navigate such complications, or especially on limited time with no increment. So I think criticism of rook c7, which is what Magnus played here, is somewhat unjustified, even if it does miss out on what potentially was a bit of an advantage. After rook e2, for instance, just to finish with this somewhat unbelievable story, the machine suggests going rook 6 c5, queen h4, queen takes f3, rook takes f2, and queen c3 back, and says white still retains a little bit of advantage. Once again, as they used to say when I was growing up, in your own games, if you, as a reply to someone who would suggest something completely outlandish, I would like to see somebody actually aiming for this position with white and believing he's better here. I don't know why I went on this rant, but the rant would make slightly more sense if somebody was actually actively suggesting any of those things, and it does appear as if I'm talking to voices in my head once again, but a little bit of ranting never really hurt anyone. Rook c7, rook takes c7, rook takes c7, king h6. And yeah, once the king reaches h6, and in particular once there is a very serious threat of rook a1, it becomes more or less immediately obvious that white no longer really is the side pushing. Queen e1 is more or less the only move. And here Hikaru played a move which looks extremely attractive, but was perhaps mathematically not the best move. Although, in general, machines suggest this is still a draw. Equilibrium has not been breached. Knight takes d5, a move I summarily dismissed during the live broadcast, saying rook c5 pins the knight and it's very unpleasant. It could have been played because after rook c5, rook a2, actually there is no way for white to exploit the pin, and black continues playing. Although even here, the machine suggests you can play b5, rook e2 and queen c1, and despite losing the f2 pawn, seemingly even this endgame is reasonably safe for white. There's also the option of immediately going rook c2 here, to even avoid the appearance of the rook on a2, and then play b5. And once again, looks a bit scary for white, but if you start looking at machine evaluations, machine seems to suggest this is an absolute dead equality, which, if it suggests that, it probably is. Anyway, rook a2 had been played with the threat of rook e2, which, once again, somewhat depressingly, and I wanted to show this because a very interesting final position is reached in that line. It is very understandable that Magnus didn't want to allow it, but even playing b5 here apparently holds rook e2, queen c1, rook takes f2, queen takes, king g1. And here the trick is, it is much stronger to play b5 on move 34 than, for instance, d6, because white needs to be able to push either one of those pawns in this position. If the rook goes to d2, the b pawn starts running. If the rook goes to b2, the d pawn starts running. That's basically the trick. But the line continues. Rook b2, d6, king f4, d7, rook d2. Now obviously the b pawn goes towards the queening square, king g3, b7, rook d1. Suddenly there is this large threat of f2 and rook takes f1 mate. If you go rook c2, black will just take on d7, and black is completely winning. But white has a very nice geometrical motif here. He can play rook c1. And b8 is a threat with check now. In view of that, black goes f2 check, king h1, and seems like black has lost. But as a matter of fact, this is still a draw. Rook takes f1, knight takes d7. And once the rook goes from f1 pretty much anywhere, for instance to b1, it's very, very important to go king f3, let's say h4, h6. And now we have this equilibrium because black threatens to run with the g-pawn towards g2. And once you give the check from b3, of course, black goes king e2. But after rook b2, you don't go forward, you go back to f3 to deny white the king h1, g2 move. And this is still a draw by perpetual, either now or at some point later in the game where white realizes he has no improvement. And so some liberties could still have been taken here, but it's very understandable that Magnus decided not to even allow rook e7. And in this position, there really isn't very much play left. White wants to go queen e3. Knight takes d5, rook e5 is not particularly attractive for black. This is not really a winning attempt, although rook e2 is still a draw, of course. And after some thought, Hikaru decided that enough is enough and played knight g4. We've seen this construction before. Hg4 is the only move, and here black gives a perpetual. This game ended in a draw, as did the other 4 games of round 3, but they were full of very interesting fight. Vladimir Kramnik almost won what originally looked like a completely equal position against Wesley So. There was a very exciting, both on the board and off the board, because Levon Aronian got himself in a really, really tough time trouble with, I think he probably finished, he made move 40 on something like 2 seconds left and played the last 5 moves on about 7 seconds. And the game was in general very interesting, the game between Levon and Anish Giri, but it did end in a draw. So the tournament situation remains the same. Vladimir Kramnik and Hikaru Nakamura are on +1. 6 people are on 50%. And there are 2 people on -1, Anish Giri and Vishy Anand. Tomorrow is a rest day, so there is other content you can watch, but you will have to wait until Saturday for round 4 of Altibox Norway Chess 2017. So please join us then for our live coverage. And this is a wrap for my recap of round 3. Thanks for watching. This has been Peter Svidler for Chess 24.